And I want to go now to Joe Patrice, and Joe is senior editor for Above the Law. Joe, thanks so much for joining us, and we're dying to hear your question.
Yeah, so one argument that was raised in the openings that I haven't heard much about since, but I would like to expand more on, is this consent of the governed argument. It was originally raised as, this was democratically passed, as were all the amendments. The counter was that, it wasn't really democratic when the kinds of people who were allowed to vote weren't the real open populace. That kind of got waved away. If we go down that road, then statutes would also be, could also be considered dead hand. But I think that my one thing is I feel like that jumps over the fact that you could get rid of statute with a simple majority, but the amendment process is so onerous that does it not stack the deck a little bit too much in favor of those smaller groups of privileged people who passed that? And that's one issue that I'd like to get a little bit more clarity on why that doesn't limit.
Thomas, why don't you take that first? Because the question was a little bit playing, I think, to your argument, but so I want to give you that crack and then bring it to Randy.
I think it does stack the deck in favor of certain segments of society, especially, and in favor of certain mindsets that are no longer that no longer prevail for the most part in this country. I think that I suspect Randy will say no because we can. If judges don't invent new rights in a non-originalist way, then this just leaves it to the people to govern themselves today. But I think that sort of elides over the fact that, for instance, when the Supreme Court takes this really aggressive meaning of the Second Amendment, it completely precludes the people today from, enacting gun control laws that are wildly popular. So I don't think I think that, in fact, because the Constitution is virtually impossible to amend in a polarized moment like this, we're sort of wedded indefinitely to the mores, the belief systems, the values of our ancestors, who in many ways were tremendous people and tremendous champions of liberty and equality, and who in many ways do not live up to the standards that we ought to be able to govern ourselves pursuant to.
This goes towards Randy then. Your recent book was about the 14th Amendment, and you also talked about all the amendments being democratic, but that, let's be honest, the 14th Amendment isn't particularly democratically passed. I mean, it was kind of forced on the South for good reasons, arguably, but how do you view that as being democratically passed?
Joe, that's one where I'm going to need you to do a little education for the general audience.
Yes, the 14th Amendment is passed in the aftermath of the Civil War. It was passed by kind of the Republicans who were in the North, who still dominated the government. The Southern states were forced to ratify it as part of ending their military occupation. So they kind of didn't have a lot of choice.
Well, I'm going to surprise Joe, I think, a little bit, maybe Tom as well. I did list the 5 normative arguments that are most commonly made on behalf of originalism, and I led off with the consent of the governed based on the democratic legitimacy of the adoption of the Constitution. I myself am not persuaded by that argument. It is not an argument that I assert on my own behalf. For many of the reasons that Joe has mentioned, I think it's fair to say that we can recognize that the Constitution became law, and when it became law, we can recognize when the 14th Amendment became law. We can actually recognize how it became law as well. On the rule of law, the judicial role and separation of powers, the consent of the governors, the fact that every person who takes power under the Constitution takes an oath to it, and finally, the relationship of the Constitution to justice.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Joe, for your questions.